Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our webinar titled Conservation Development, a Technique to Help Communities Meet Their Land Preservation, Climate Change, and Water Quality Goals, brought to you by Grow Smart Rhode Island and the town of Charlestown, Rhode Island. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program, along with Pang Suti Sumbat, Network Project Manager from the New England Environmental Finance Center. And before we get started, I would like to introduce and provide you all with a little background about the SNEP Network. The SNEP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through the management of stormwater and restoration projects. The SNEP Network focuses on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, snepnetwork.org. And before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a Q&A session. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. Additionally, there's a chat feature on your Zoom control panel. We will be sharing links to resources during the webinar through the chat feature. We also encourage participants to share and introduce themselves through the chat or add comments during the webinar. We also have closed captions available for today's webinar. To view the closed captions, please click the closed captions icon on your Zoom control panel. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Lorraine Joubert, Director of NEMO Program at the University of Rhode Island, and she'll be introducing our speakers for today. And I'll now hand things over to Lorraine. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Leah. Conservation development has been around for a long time, about 30 years, but is now widely considered the most effective low-impact development site design technique that communities can use to protect open space and reduce impervious cover. According to Scott Millar, 17 Rhode Island towns have conservation development ordinances, but many were adopted before LID was the required standard. So the Charlestown update is of great interest, as it is the first in Rhode Island to specifically promote LID for more effective stormwater management and resilient development. I can think of no other Rhode Island planners as well qualified to address conservation development than our two speakers, Scott Millar and Jane Weidman. Scott Millar is the Director of Community Technical Assistance and Conservation with Grow Smart Rhode Island since 2015, where he is working on agriculture, forestry, conservation development, and renewable energy siting issues. Prior to joining Grow Smart, Scott worked for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management for 23 years, most recently as the administrator of the Sustainable Watersheds Office, where he spearheaded the development of smart growth guidance manuals and training programs on topics such as village growth, farm and forest preservation, conservation development, low impact development, and the transfer of development rights. Scott has also 25 years of practical experience in the town of Exeter, Rhode Island, where he serves as the chair of the planning board and has served as Conservation Commission Chair, Community Comprehensive Plan Coordinator, and other leadership roles. Our second speaker is Jane Weidman, AICP, and she is the town planner for Charlestown, Rhode Island, a coastal community on the south shore of Rhode Island since 2015. And that's located right where these coastal ponds are on the shore and further inland, near the mouth of the Pawcatuck River and just on the boundary of our study area. There she completed a major update of the town comprehensive plan and secured many open space grants. Prior to that, Jane Weidman was the town planner for Block Island. It's actually town of New Shoreham here, where she developed innovative development standards to protect the island's unique habitat and scenic character by controlling building mass and scale. She also drafted a town energy plan and obtained funding for and managed a sea level rise study, one of the first in Rhode Island. Previously, Ms. Weidman served as a consulting planner for several Rhode Island suburban and coastal communities, focusing on resource protection and innovative zoning techniques, from commercial design standards to alternative energy siting standards. She is also an active member of the Rhode Island chapter of the American Planning Association and serves as their legislative liaison, where she is widely recognized for her expertise on local land use issues. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Scott Millar as our first presenter.
Lorraine. Just bring it slide. And as Lorraine mentioned, conservation development has been around for over 30 years. I've been involved with it for probably close to 25 years. And what conservation development is, it's really a type of cluster development that allows a community to guide growth to the most appropriate areas on a parcel of land, to avoid impacts to natural resources, and to protect the character-defining features of that property. It has as a goal to preserve, at a minimum, 50% of the land that could otherwise be developed as permanently protected open space. It will have a conservation easement that will run with the chain of title that prevents that land from getting developed in the future. Since one picture is worth 1,000 words, let me give you sort of an illustrative examples of how this works. This is a site, and for those of you from Rhode Island may know this site. It's actually on Route 138. It's west of URI. Let me point out some of the character-defining features here. It's an historic farmstead. It's a state-designated scenic road on 138. There's beautiful vistas into this historic farm. It has prime agricultural land. It has wetlands and stream complexes that are on the property. And that interspersion of open fields and forested area provides very unique and very valuable habitat. So this is what happens to it using conventional large lot zoning. As you can see, all of the character defining features I previously described are really irreversibly destroyed, aren't they? I mean, clearly the farm is no more, the scenic quality is gone. I mean, really everything has been dramatically altered. And we tend to blame the development community for this land use pattern. And a key point I'd like to make is it's not development itself that's necessarily the problem. Instead, it's really the way that many towns have been encouraging development, in many cases requiring development to occur. That's really the issue. Because with techniques such as conservation development, it is possible to accommodate development and avoid impacts to the environment and community character. So this is what this same site looks like. Same number of houses that you saw in the previous large lot scenario, only now we're using a very flexible 10-step design process to determine where on this particular parcel the development is most appropriate. So we've really protected most of the character defining features, and we've kept the development as far away as we reasonably can from the wetlands and stream complexes. This is showing you an example of a rural community. This happens to be Foster. It's about 83 acres, and this parcel was actually going to be developed when we first started working with this landowner. What they were trying to do is generate some revenue from their property, and they thought the best way to do that was to sell it for development. But then once we showed them what that might look like, they were appalled, and they actually took this site off the market. Because once you try to maximize development potential, you're talking about building a town road, which is very expensive and time consuming for developers to do. And once they do that, obviously they have to maximize the amount of development that that parcel can reasonably yield. So we tried to show an alternative. Instead of building a town road, which is very expensive to build, why not use a private road, use the conservation development approach to find where on this property the development is most suitable. You can reduce the lot sizes to whatever again, there's flexibility here. They can be as little as a half an acre. And then that sort of tucks this development into the corner of this parcel, and the remainder of this land can remain in perpetuity as one farm and woodlot that can be managed to sort of maintain the character of a rural town. I like to call this sort of stealth development. It just sort of blends into the background, and it really helps protect what's already there. Here's an example from an urban area. This happens to be the city of Woonsocket. They use the conservation development approach to protect 10 acres in their city. 10 acres in an urban area is really a substantial amount of land. But here they used multifamily or duplexes to try to get more density out of the parcel. And many of these units have been deed restricted for low and moderate income housing. And they also did a nice job of blending those low and moderate income housing units in to the market rate housing. So you really can't tell the difference. There's no stigma of anyone living in a low and moderate income unit. Here's another example showing how this technique can be used for mixed use development. No one wanted to see this land use pattern. This is currently how that area is zoned. So instead of doing something that looks like this, towns could actually use the same conservation development approach to put a mixture of uses in a compact development pattern that sort of replicates a village or a rural hamlet. You're actually seeing some commercial as well as residential, and also different residential types. Again, you could intersperse some multifamily, you could do some apartments. It's a development pattern that actually yields more value per acre than just large lot subdivisions. So let's talk about the advantages of this. And let's first talk about what's in it for communities. What are the economic advantages to them? Well, it helps them preserve land without buying it. It can dramatically reduce town service costs for roads. You're getting a lot narrower and less mileage of town roads in a conservation development than a standard large lot subdivision. And homes typically have more value, increasing tax revenue. Sorry, it's not advancing for some reason. And I apologize for that. Found an alternative way, thanks. So let's talk about the economic advantages for landowners. There's been a number of studies done, and that document that construction costs can be reduced by as much as 40%. A lot of that is in new road construction costs. There was a study done in South Kingstown, Rhode Island, that documented that conservation development lots can sell 47% faster than their equivalent size lot in a conventional subdivision. The conservation development lots were selling for 17% more than a lot in a standard subdivision. There was a national study done by Colorado State University, done by the National Association of Realtors, that found that conservation development lots were 20 to 29% sold 20 to 29% more than residential lots in a standard subdivision. So that bears to the Rhode Island study is very similar. They also looked at 5-year appreciation rates. Would conservation development hold its value over time? The answer is yes. Over 5 years, conservation development lots were 11% more valuable than the standard subdivision. 10-year appreciation rates were very similar. And what they found in all of this is really lot sizes had no correlation to house value. Instead, it was really the size and the type of open space that influenced the house values. And the key lesson here is all homes that have access to open space benefit from that increased economic value. Because what I've heard over the years from some landowners is that they were opposed to conservation development, thinking that smaller lot sizes weren't going to be as valuable as a conventional large lot. And obviously, all of this documents that's not true. So let's talk about the environmental advantages. And there's really a very long list. This list includes, but is certainly not limited to, it can help preserve vegetative buffers along wetlands, streams, and ponds to protect water quality. It can reduce stormwater runoff by cutting down impervious surfaces like streets and driveways. It helps to protect critical habitat and travel corridors for wildlife. And it really does a long way of reducing fragmentation of forest blocks. It can help preserve prime farmland. So conservation development also helps meet the requirements for low impact development stormwater. And that's what Elaine alluded to previously. A lot of towns adopted their conservation development ordinance before Rhode Island made the shift to low impact development. But nonetheless, the conservation development technique by itself really helps meet the standards for low impact development in Rhode Island. This is right out of DEM's Stormwater Guidance Manual. The first goal is to avoid the impacts to natural features and pre-development hydrology. And then it gives 4 objectives. Obviously, how do you do that? How do you achieve goal 1? Well, you need to protect open space to maintain pre-development hydrology. You need to protect surface waters, wetlands, and buffers. You need to minimize clearing and grading, and you need to reduce soil compaction. If your town has adopted conservation development, it's very easy to achieve goal 1 in all 4 objectives. If you're dealing with standard large lot subdivisions, frankly, it's a lot more challenging to comply with this goal. Now let's take a look at how conservation development can help be used to pull development away from wetlands and other sensitive areas. This is an actual example that came into DEM when I was working there. We saw a lot of subdivision proposals like this. The blue area is showing you wetlands. And typically, a large lot subdivision is going to have a portion of its lot line as part of a wetland. And as long as the development itself is kept out of the wetland, these types of subdivisions would get approved by DEM. The problem is that over time, even though the developer keeps their house lot out of the wetland, landowners who buy these house lots lose sight of where the wetland boundaries are, and over time tend to encroach upon the wetland with their backyards, outbuildings, gardens, you name it. And it's been a constant problem. And frankly, it's almost impossible to prevent and to enforce. Here's an alternative. It's the same number of house lots that you saw in the previous slide, but now we're reducing the lot sizes, and all of the lots avoid having any portion of their lot be part of a wetland. So let's look at the comparisons. Under a conventional subdivision, there were going to be 24 lots that were going to be impacting a wetland to some degree. Under the conservation development, now there are none. We took the average lot size and reduced it from 3 acres to ½ acre, which is still a reasonable size lot. And look at the difference in the length of street. We're reducing street length by over a mile. That's a mile of pavement that the developer doesn't have to build. And that's a mile of pavement that the town doesn't have to own and operate and maintain over time. That's just a big cost savings. And look at the huge difference in open space. There's a negligible amount of open space left in a conventional versus 82% in the conservation development. Very dramatic differences. Now let's take a look at how towns are beginning to use conservation development to link up protected open space in their town. This is showing you a slide from North Kingstown, Rhode Island. 24% of the town has already been protected. Either the purple on here is land that the town has gone out to purchase, or the state agency or some public entity owns it. The orange on this map is showing you that land that was protected at no cost to the town by using either their former cluster or their new conservation development ordinance. So at the present time, 40% of the total conservation land in North Kingstown has been protected by essentially the development process. And what the town is really now doing a really good job of doing is they're linking up these protected pieces of open space to make continuous corridors of open space, because any open space that's an island disconnected from other protected open space simply just isn't as valuable. Now I'd like to talk about how conservation development is different than a former cluster. And this is showing you probably a pretty good example of the types of cluster subdivisions that we were seeing in the 90s and the 80s in particular. And here they're just reducing the lot sizes to make them a little bit smaller. There's really no protection or thought given to trying to identify the most important open space. So what they typically did is they just made a buffer around the development, and that was the open space that was protected. And what we found was over time, the people that bought into these subdivisions would extend their lawns and backyards into that protected open space. So eventually there really wasn't anything protected. And in this particular instance, obviously the site designer had a hard time coming up with whatever the quota was that this town wanted as open space. So he put that meaningless little donut hole in the middle of the subdivision that obviously doesn't really have any value as protected open space whatsoever. And this is what these subdivisions tended to look like. Again, there wasn't a design process. People were just making small lots, pushing houses closer together. No thought given to protecting some of the existing site features that were previously there. And there's really no wonder that people were reacting very negatively to cluster development. And that probably came to a crescendo probably in the late 90s, which sort of led to conservation development in Rhode Island. So as I mentioned before, conservation development uses a 10-step design process to try to identify where on that parcel it's most appropriate to develop. And again, this is what really distinguishes it from cluster. So I'm going to go take you back to the site that we saw at the beginning and sort of walk you through very quickly that 10-step design process so you can get a better understanding of the process that was used and how it was determined where development is appropriate on this parcel. So the first thing that we're really doing is we're analyzing the site. And really one of the most important things that can be done is use readily available information. This is in Rhode Island Geographic Information System. So we're not asking developers to go out and do a very expensive analysis. A lot of this information, again, it's available for free and readily available for their site designers to use. What you're seeing here in red is hydric soils, and the sort of the mustard colored color is soils that have a seasonal high water table between 19 and 36 inches. The hydric soils in particular, notice how they sort of run on the land in a linear fashion. Those are really low water streams. So what we're trying to do is identify those areas that are wetlands, hydric soils, and have seasonal high water tables to guide growth away from those areas as much as we reasonably can. Next step is we're looking at other natural resources that are on this parcel. In this case, we have prime agricultural soils, we have unfragmented forest, there's wetlands, etc. And again, all this can be readily identified. And then we're looking at what other cultural features might be on this site. In this case, it's a state designated scenic road. There's an historic farmstead. Again, you're just picking, there's interesting stone walls. You can really begin to identify all the character defining features that you might want to try to protect. Then we're looking at the site context. What's around this site that might be impacted in the event we put development on this parcel? And here you can see there's a groundwater aquifer that runs through here. There's a wellhead protection area. There's a state designated greenway. So there's a lot going on around this parcel that we really need to be mindful of to do a good job of avoiding impacts to those resources. Then the next step in the this process, we're really trying to pull this together and say, okay, what are the non-buildable areas? And here we're saying it's wetlands, they're regulated setbacks, and hydric soils. We're also looking at partially constrained. And again, that's that seasonal high water table between 19 and 36 inches. In Rhode Island, you can put a septic system there, but it's not desirable. So now we're trying to pull this all together. As a planning board member, it was always difficult for my fellow members to sort of see the big picture, especially when we're looking at black and white design plans. So we encourage developers to use color coding because it just makes it really easy, particularly for the public, to see what's happening on this parcel. So the green area is that area that can be developed, but it's been determined we'd like to try to protect it if possible. The red here on this site is those areas that are unbuildable, they're wetlands, they're hydric soils, and they're regulated setbacks. The orange area is that area that has some constraints, but it can be developed. The white area in the center of the parcel has really no constraints, and that's how we came to the conclusion of where development is most appropriate on this particular parcel. And the way this works is conservation development is density neutral, meaning if the developer can get 20 house lots in a conventional subdivision, they have to get 20 house lots in a conservation development. So if those 20 house lots can't go into that white area in the center of this diagram, then they'll push into the green, but never into the red or the orange. And this is just showing you the next step in the process. And you have to develop a yield plan. Towns have been doing this already. Then you're just looking at conceptual options. Again, notice there's no engineered design diagrams here. We're just looking at what are some options to sort of lay out development on this parcel. Next step in the process is we're laying out where are the best areas to have house sites and trying to keep in mind low impact development, limits of disturbance, sort of laying that conceptual development area out. And again, it's just showing you there's different options to do that. Next is we're beginning to identify ownership options. And here we're not just laying out where the house lots are going to go. Where's the open space going to go? And in this case, we want to protect some of that open space as a working farm. Then the next step in the process is just saying, okay, what is that open space going to get used for? So in this particular case, we want to maintain active agricultural use. We want to maintain forest conservation. It can also be perhaps a neighborhood park. And there can be some recreational trails. So you want to have people think about, if you're going to preserve open space, what is that open space going to get used for in the future? And really build that into the process. In Rhode Island, there's 4 ownership options for that open space. It can be owned by the city or town. The ownership can be by a nonprofit, which principal purpose is conservation. That could be a land trust. That could be a group like the Nature Conservancy, Audubon Society. The ownership can be by a homeowners association, or Rhode Island law is unique. It allows private ownership if the use is going to be for forest, agriculture, or habitat use, and that's consistent with the community's comprehensive plan. Regardless of what ownership option you choose, we recommend that you sort of layer these ownerships. So if you wouldn't want to designate just to a homeowners association, if that association should go out of business or become non-functional, you want somebody else that's holding title to that easement. So that's the process that we took, going through it very quickly to determine why this was the best place to build on this particular site. All of this is described in great detail in the Rhode Island Conservation Development Guidance Manual. This was done by Peter Flinker from Dotson and Flinker. He really did a masterful job in explaining this. And we worked on this a number of years ago. It's a Rhode Island Conservation Easement Guidance Manual. We found out that towns were doing a pretty good job when they purchased a piece of land and putting in an appropriate easement, but they weren't doing a very good job on protecting the open space to a conservation development. So we made some really clear guidance on how that process should work. And as was mentioned at the beginning, the status in Rhode Island, we have 18 towns that have adopted it. We think there's about 64% of Rhode Island towns that are sort of eligible, meaning they're not urban and they're not totally built out. So we think we're making pretty good progress. I'll stop there and I'll entertain questions after Jane presents.
Scott, I believe you have to, yes. Okay. Can everyone see? Great. So my presentation is an overview of the town's recent work on and adoption of the Conservation Development Ordinance in Charlestown after years of working under a more typical cluster regulations. Now, Charlestown, as you saw, is located along the south coastal shore of Rhode Island. It's between South Kingston and Westerly. And you can see the Route 1 corridor running east-west that is actually built along the original Old Post Road, which connected Boston to New York. It has approximately 59 square miles with a year-round population of less than 8,000, with about 5,200 housing units total, but only about 3,600 of those are year-round. So there's a large vacation population in the area south of Route 1 along the beaches and the coastal ponds. So there's really no town center. There's a very small amount of commercial land, which is shown in red here, and only one industrial site up. It's a still operating textile mill along the Pawcatuck River. So by and large, it's a residential community. It has some active farms and large holdings of open space, but it does have approximately 2,800 acres of residential land available for development. So we did a rough calculation and build out, and that would allow between 4,000 and 7,000 new house lots. So Charlestown has a history of local government with a strong environmental focus. The town has an on-site wastewater management program that monitors the 5,000 or so on-site systems through a state-enabled program, and that's for communities without sewers. And it also has a strong stormwater management plan that meets the municipal stormwater regulations, even though the town only has localized drainage networks. And the wastewater stormwater manager, Matt Dowling, he also is a prolific grant writer and was recently involved in a SNAP pilot watersheds initiative. And Charlestown also has a strong flood management program. Our floodplain manager, Joe Warner, has worked to give the town a community rating system of 6. That's the lowest level in New England, the only 6, I believe, in New England. And that qualifies the residents for a reduced flood insurance under FEMA. And much of the basis for this rating is the large amounts of protected open space and also the strong regulatory stance that the town takes in terms of stormwater management and building restrictions in the flood hazard areas. Also recently established through town ordinance was a climate resiliency commission. And another example is its dark sky ordinance, which is really important in Charlestown. We do have a nationally known observatory. So this actually shows the areas, the conservation land maps from the recently adopted comprehensive plan, which shows the large areas of protected open space by category of ownership. See, the Rhode Island DEM owns quite a bit of state park land, about 4,500 acres. That's shown in the bright green. And the Nature Conservancy and other private organizations own another 1,700 acres. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife, that's shown in the olive owns about 875 acres. And then what's of interest and unique to Charlestown is the area shown in gray is land that's held in trust by the Narragansett Indian tribe, and they own about 1,800 acres, but over 1,500 of that must remain protected. And then the town has about 700 acres. And then if you can see in yellow, that's all of the private land that's protected in private ownership, including all of the original cluster development open space. So with these characteristics, it's not surprising Charlestown has had a cluster regulation since the early 1900s. And I did a quick check of those areas of private open space in clusters, and I determined that the town has had 15 such subdivisions ranging in size from just a few lots to upwards of 37 lots, resulting in about 250 single family lots in cluster development. And there also was one development which provided 32 units as multifamily elderly. So cluster has been mandatory for subdivisions over 5 lots as long as I can remember, as long as I've been working in Charlestown. And they have typically been in the range of 10 to 12 lots, although we have one under review now that's 36 lots. So here is an example of a very early cluster. It was similar to the example that Scott just showed you. It's not terribly inventive. There's 10 lots, about an acre each in an R3A zone, with about 7 acres of protected open space. And here's another example about 10 years later. It seems to be a little more creative in terms of how the lots are delineated. This is also 10 lots, and they were about an acre each in a 3-acre zone with about 29 acres of open space protected, including all of the wetlands along the stream. It also has a beautiful curving road, which is heavily treed. That's grown up nicely in the ensuing years. So fast forward to 2020 and 2021, Charlestown just completed a lengthy, sometimes challenging, entire rewrite of its comprehensive plan. And most of the major work was ending just as the pandemic set in. So the plan has a lot of emphasis on rural and village character, and how land is regulated through zoning and subdivision was obviously a focal point. So recommendation in the plan was to make use of enhanced cluster specifically through conservation design, because the town is in that unique situation of having only private wells and on-site septic with lots of density in its coastal environment. And there's always been an interest in protecting groundwater and other natural resources. So establishing conservation development, especially since there were 17 other towns ahead of us, was a logical recommendation out of the comprehensive plan. So along came Scott and Lorraine to help us draft the regulations. And I think they will be the first to tell you that Charlestown has a very engaged planning commission, a 7-member board, and they were really willing to undertake the time-consuming work of review and input and sharing local history. And I do want to note that much of this work, the working sessions and the public workshop, was all done via WebEx, including the public workshop. And so involvement from the community was initially very light. So I want you to remember that point for later in the presentation. So again, conservation development was a logical fit for Charlestown. And I think most of you are aware that there's 2 sets of regulations that need to be amended. The zoning ordinance, which is adopted and amended by the town council, that grants the authority for conservation development. It establishes the zoning districts, which govern dimensional standards. And then the subdivision regulations, which are adopted and amended by the Planning Commission, and that governs overall lot design and development standards, as well as the procedures for review and approval. So the amendments to the subdivision regulations included specifically the 10-step process that Scott described in much more detail on open space plans and design standards. So the Planning Commission was involved in drafting both sets of regulations, and when we went through the process, these were the major interests that they had in changing from cluster to conservation development. What to incorporate, what's useful and needed from the cluster regulations that are already in place, what to include in the purpose statement, and that really did take a lot of discussion, what definitions needed to be added or amended, and then of course the major issues of how are the lots designed and how much open space to protect and how the open space is managed. So the Planning Commission did have an interest in keeping the regulations as consistent as possible with the cluster regulations that had been on the books for 30 years, particularly the zoning ordinance amendments. So aside from the dimensional changes to lot sizes in the open space areas, most of the changes were contained in the subdivision regulations through the mapping requirements and the review process. So the conservation development regulations had the same applicability, 6 or more lots, and the same allowable uses as the cluster ordinance, single family, farm, and accessory. And of course, the density, as Scott alluded to, is based on the number of lots that can be built under a conventional subdivision. And the ownership options were the same. So the purpose statement was enhanced to reference these specific items in terms of what should be protected and what should be incorporated into the design. And then among the definitions that were amended was the definition constraints to development, and that describes which lands are taken out of density calculations of a given parcel. Now, this always includes wetlands, but this can vary among different communities in Rhode Island. And what is meant by low impact development? And what are the procedures for determining density in the form of the number of lots? And that is the yield plan. So the lot sizes in road frontages set by the zoning ordinance under conservation development were changed from those of cluster to allow the minimum lot size in any zoning district to be 20,000 square feet, and the minimum road frontage to be 50 feet with an option to reduce to 20 feet. And this was the major change. And the reason for that is to build in flexibility when the lots are being laid out to achieve all of the purposes that Scott described. And this would allow a design other than cluster lots, which are essentially 1 acre conventional lots. They're designed just under our previous cluster, they were designed like 40,000 square foot lots. Because the lot sizes under conservation development can be reduced by greater percentages, as the minimum lot size under zoning increases, then there's an opportunity to save more open space. So these graduated percentages were established in the R2A, particularly in the R2A and the R3A zones. And in this case, suitable land is essentially that land without constraint. So that is the land that can't be built on anyway, or shouldn't be built on. And these are the required open space percentages. And then the allowable percentages of active recreation and impervious surfaces was also reduced from the cluster regulations, and that was done for a couple of reasons. You see, it went from 35% active recreation to 15%, and then from 25% of the open space impervious to 10%. And that these were considered to be very high numbers to begin with. And if you're protecting more open space, you would need less land for active recreation. So the conservation development regulations are much more explicit in terms of what site information we will request the applicant to provide, and then how that information is delineated with mapping. And one new requirement in the subdivision regulations is a specific site analysis map with all of those listed features. And Scott did provide you an example of what that would look like. And then, although there's a separate stormwater section in the subdivision regulations with reference to low impact development, the conservation development regulations contain a whole subsection that specifically requires, when designing the subdivision, that the natural drainage features be incorporated and the runoff after development must match that of pre-development, and an emphasis is placed on reducing impervious surfaces and even altered surfaces such as lawns. And of course, the movement away from point sources of stormwater discharge. And Scott did cover this a lot, but all of this conservation development now would have a plan for the open space that's set aside. And that includes the ownership, which he described those four. Typically, it would be a homeowners association, but there are other options. How the land is to be used, how much is active, where structures and trails are located, how it is to be managed and maintained. And there's a lot of detail on what resources should be conserved through the protected open space. And Charlestown in particular requires or prefers that all wetlands, all buffers, and all flood areas be moved out of the house lots and into conservation development. And then, of course, the specific standards when you're designing the open space. It's important that it be as contiguous as possible and accessible, and that the characteristics of adjoining parcels be considered. This is an example of an open space plan we recently got. This is not conservation development. This is that 36 lot cluster that's currently under review. And you can't see the lots, how they're delineated. They are basically typical 1 acre lots, but this does show where the water bodies are within the common open space, where existing trails are, where proposed trails would be, where pavilions or active recreation structures would be built, where parking is provided, and there is some drainage allowed within the open space. So with all that good work, what happened? So trouble started brewing in the early spring. There was some resistance in the community, and this was not necessarily out of naturally occurring concerns, but ones that were being actively nurtured. After all, cluster had been around a long time, 30 years. And the issue was aggravated by a series of honest mistakes with the newspaper notice for the zoning ordinance amendments, which resulted in 4 separate notice periods, and each one of those had to be done 3 successive weeks prior to the actual hearing date. And each time there was a notice error, it had to be withdrawn and then sent back to the town council for a new date. So we thought we were ready in June, and then the newspaper ad was printed with the entire ordinance with the May date that had been canceled. So while the amendments were ready in February, the first public hearing was not held until July 11th. And so by that time, there had been enough stirring to generate a lot of interest. And the 5-member town council at the time was split 3-2 between 2 opposing camps, and with one camp sort of anti-regulations, somewhat pro-development in terms of let's have more commercial land and more housing, and we certainly don't need any more open space. And that included the council president. They had 2 votes, and the other 3 were supportive of the comprehensive plan, open space in general, and of course, the conservation development regulations. So these aren't really political parties, they're just ideological parties. But the closer we got to the election, there was more noise made and it became more worrisome. So here's an example of an outreach that was done by a local lawyer who also posts negative comments on social media while she is representing applicants before the Planning Commission. And this letter was sent out to about 150 landowners who have more than 10 acres of property. And I think this was the reason the first public hearing was packed. Say the capacity of the room is 100, but realistically more like 85. The second hearing, scheduled 3 days later, was canceled due to capacity issues. So they moved the third hearing to the elementary school cafeteria, which has unlimited seating. And then the last was back at Town Hall with a much smaller crowd once some amendments were made, and the vote of 3-2 was a foregone conclusion. So you've heard a lot of wonderful things from Scott about what conservation development can do, but we were told it was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and it's nothing more than an overland grab. And as part of this letter campaign and letters to the editor and social media, there was a lot of misinformation. One was that conservation development is not the next phase of cluster or the next step of cluster, but it completely eliminates cluster. The ability to have 20,000 square foot lots means that the Planning Commission will mandate these, even though the current cluster. And then in terms of single family lots, even though the current cluster also only allows single family lots, the conservation development regulations were accused of being exclusionary and elitist. And then what was most shocking, I think, was this information sent around that the open space must be owned by the town or a nonprofit. And that became a major point of discussion during the hearing. We had to convince the members of the public that the property owner themselves had the ability to determine how the open space is owned. And then open space set-asides were basically a taking, requiring compensation, and even that the conservation easement that must be on the open space land is illegal. So we had a lot to do to just counter the additional misinformation. But what was most challenging was this message that got out there that conservation development, because of its built-in flexibility, it allows fewer rights and it puts too much power into the hands of the Planning Commission. So as a result of this input, there were some changes made. Originally, the open space set-asides were going to be 70, 60, and 50, and they were reduced by 10% for each of the 3 districts. There was a sense that the 10% of open space for active recreation was too small, and so that was increased to 15% of the open space. And then there was some questions, why can't conservation development be optional? And this was discussed, but it was felt, the Planning Commission felt pretty strongly that because the cluster regulations are mandatory with an opt-out provision, which there also is for conservation development, that they did not want to make this optional for the larger subdivisions. And then why not have both sets of regulations on the book? And that was not recommended either, because you would end up having 2 sets of procedures and 2 applications and 2 checklists for these larger subdivisions, and that could cause confusion. and also be an extra burden on the staff and the board. So I think what was maybe most surprising for me and possibly Scott and others was the immovability of the positions that people took on these issues when words like property rights and takings and unconstitutional were used. And we had one farm couple who doubtless loved their farm, shown here, and they're very proud of keeping it into the going for generations, and they have no intention of developing it, but they were nonetheless vehemently opposed to conservation development. And no amount of kind, convincing conversations could convince them that conservation development would actually give them more options than a conventional cluster. And this is their 41-acre farm. So I did take the opportunity of this presentation, and I don't have it delineated here, but how of their 41 acres, they have about 14 acres in active use, which would include the barns and the built area as well as the open fields. So they could cut out one 14-acre farm lot. 11 acres could be an agricultural easement, which would give them part of their required open space or most of their open space. And they still could get 1-acre house lots. But of course, they'd have to go into the wooded area. And that still would leave them 17 acres plus or minus. They do have some constrained land, some wetlands, and there's a power line. I think having examples to show people of what could happen with their land under the different sets of regulations would be really useful. So I do want to say that what was also interesting was that after the zoning amendments passed in late August, we pulled together subdivision regulation amendments, which is, as I have stated, contained a lot more information, more regulations that could have been contested or at least challenged, and not a solitary member of the public showed up. So then, other than the board members and staff, we spoke to an empty hearing room, and then less than a week later, the election happened, and the anti-CD forces took the town council. Now it's 4-1 instead of 2-3, and only one of the 3 progressives ran, and she came in 5th by vote count. So we were successful in adopting the regulations, but we're still unpacking why were so many people motivated to come out. And over 100 people or 120 people, that's a big crowd in Charlestown. So a lot of it was misinformation. And I think that's just the state of affairs today. If you repeat something enough times, even though it's false, people will believe it, as well as exaggerations. And then I think once it gets to a certain pitch that people become invested in their positions, and it makes it hard for them to back down. And at the public hearing, as I stated, we were in the position of correcting as much information, spending as much time doing that as we were presenting our positive information. I also think there's just a few hardcore that resent regulations, even though regulations are for the community at large. They were uncomfortable with the Planning Commission having that they already have a review authority, and when you build in flexibility through conservation development, who gets to choose, the property owner or the town? And then some of this is just the age-old division. We've all seen it in New England, I think, of longtime property owners who have a lot invested in their land, and they don't necessarily want to develop, but they don't want other people telling them what to do with their land. And then there are always people who need an issue to run on, and the conservation development, I think in Charlestown, it just came at the right time, and it could be framed in such a way that one group of people are taking away your rights, so you need to elect a different group of people to preserve your rights. So one major point to counter this is to rely on the comprehensive plan. Rhode Island considers the comprehensive plan to have ordinance status, and under the Comprehensive Planning Act, it requires that the town's zoning and subdivision regulations be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And it was clear in several chapters of the comprehensive plan what Charlestown wanted to do in terms of its development patterns and protecting its open space and village areas, and specifically to implement cluster and conservation design to achieve those purposes. So I would just end with this. I thought of some things of, these are some of my thoughts of how you could possibly prepare better. And you might have some ideas of your own. The town did a townwide survey that was done in 2021 at considerable expense. And some of the numbers that came in through that survey were pretty strong in terms of protecting the environment and natural resources and Charlestown's rural character and open space. It has a very low tax rate and a strong sense of not necessarily anti-growth, but designing new growth so that it's compatible with the community. And then developing a committed local constituency, and I think outside of government. And that's, I don't pay any attention to the local social media, but apparently there was a lot out there that was very negative towards this regulation and towards the Planning Commission in general. So there is another group that has a very good web page that counters some of this stuff, but perhaps not with the same intensity. And now I think that to keep the conservation development regulations and other positive things that have been done in Charlestown over the last several years, that I think the group that's out of power now has to pay attention and attend meetings, because people end up participating when they're against something more so than when they're for something. And then of course we need to keep a connection with our other planners and professionals, and to keep the lines of communication open with the other 17 towns and with our state agencies, and of course our professional organization. Another thought that we had was to bring in the engineers and the developers who have worked with conservation development and their success stories, as well as property owners who made the decision to use conservation development as their tool for subdividing. So that's where we are. We haven't had an application come in yet. We've updated all of our amendments and we are waiting to see what happens. And again, we have to thank Scott and Lorraine for all their considerable support. It was quite appreciated. So I can stop sharing now. Okay, questions?
Great. So it looks like we are out of time. We're a little bit over. There was a lot of information there to process and digest, but we got a couple of questions in the question and answer box, and just due to time, what we'll do is just follow up with participants, and we'll give our panelists an opportunity to respond and then send it to you all via email. I did want to say that the recording and the copy of the presentation slides will be available after the webinar is over. And I encourage you, if you have any questions, to go ahead and contact Scott or Jane, who are critical to the success of the Conservation Development Ordinance. With that, I will go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you all for joining, and please look forward to any follow-up materials that you have. And again, the emails are here, so if you have any questions specific for Scott or Jane, feel free to reach out. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Scott.
Okay.
Bye.
All right,
Bye.
thank you. Bye-bye.